In 1942, the Red Army faced a question that sounded like a joke until they actually tried to answer it. How do you get a tank into battle when there's no road, no bridge, and no time to wait for heavy transports? Oleg Antonov, one of the Soviet Union's boldest aircraft designers, had an answer that stunned even his own engineers. You don't carry the tank to the front, you make it fly. The machine that followed would look like something out of a pulp magazine. A light tank sprouting enormous wooden wings lumbering through the air behind a bomber. It would be called the Antonov A-40, the world's first and last flying tank. By the early 1940s, airborne warfare was exploding. German paratroopers were dropping onto Crete. The Allies were experimenting with gliders that could land jeeps, guns, even light armor behind enemy lines. The Soviets wanted the same edge. They'd already tried crude methods. In the 1930s, heavy bombers like the TB-3 carried tiny T-27 tankettes slung beneath their bellies, releasing them from low altitude onto soft ground. The tanks usually survived, barely. Their crews were flown in separately, and by the time the men reached the drop zone, the vehicles had been found or destroyed. What the Red Army needed was a way to land a tank with its crew, ready to fight within minutes of touching down. A one-piece assault weapon that could glide silently into a clearing, drop its wings, and roll straight into combat. That was the vision handed to Antonov's design bureau in the spring of 1942. A wing tank to support airborne troops or partisans far behind German lines. Antonov had already built dozens of gliders for the Soviet Air Force. He knew what wood and fabric could do and how quickly it could be produced. So instead of designing a massive cargo glider to carry a tank, he flipped the problem on its head. His concept, codenamed A-40 Krylyatanka, literally tank wings, turned the vehicle itself into the fuselage. A standard T-60 light tank would be stripped down for weight, then fitted with a detachable biplane wing and twin-boom tail. The wings would be built from spruce and canvas, the tail braced by steel tubing. In theory, a heavy bomber would tow the hybrid into the air, release it near the battlefield, and the tank glider would coast down like an enormous leaf. On landing, quick release pins would let the crew jettison the wings, start the engine, and drive straight into action. One engineer later joked that Antonov had designed a turtle with delusions of flight. But to Soviet command, desperate for innovation, the idea seemed worth at least one try. Antonov's engineers began work in the summer of 1942 at their Moscow workshop. They started with a T-60 light tank, one of the smallest in Red Army service. Two-man crew, 20mm cannon, thin armor, barely enough for reconnaissance but light enough to dream with. To make it fly, they stripped it down. Out went most of the armor plating, the ammunition, even some of the fuel. Every kilogram mattered. What remained was an empty steel shell weighing just over 7 tons. Around that shell they built a detachable cradle, broad wooden biplane wings braced with struts, and behind them a twin-boom tailplane like a dragonfly's. The frame was wood and fabric, cheap, fast, and fragile. Control cables ran from a simple cockpit inside the tank's turret hatch to flaps and rudders on the tail. The result looked less like an aircraft and more like a field workshop hallucination. Test crews started calling it Cherepakha, the turtle. But to Antonov, it was proof of concept, a tank that could soar long enough to cross a front line, land on its treads, and fight. On paper, the equations were brutal. Even a light tank with wings needed 160 kilometers an hour of tow speed just to stay airborne. The only aircraft available with enough power was the 4-engine Tupolev TB-3, a bomber already obsolete and overworked. Antonov's team ran the numbers anyway. The TB-3 could lift around 8 tons under perfect conditions. The A-40 weighed almost exactly that, and its wings added drag like a barn door. During ground tests, engineers joked the bomber would have to tow a house through molasses. They tried to cheat the math, removing the turret, limiting fuel, sanding down edges of the wing ribs to shave grams. But the laws of physics wouldn't budge. Still, in wartime Russia, ideas died only after they'd been tried once. Command approved a single test flight. September 2, 1942. At Zhukovsky Airfield outside Moscow, a TB-3 heavy bomber rumbled down the runway with the strangest payload in the world behind it, a tank sprouting wings. At the controls of the glider sat Sergei Anokhin, one of the USSR's best test pilots. He'd spent years flying sailplanes that looked like birds. Today he was flying a tank. The bomber lifted, engines howling. The tank glider lurched into the air, the tow cable humming under strain. For several minutes they climbed steadily. Then the TB-3 began to slow. Drag from the A-40 was too much. The engines overheated. The tug pilot signaled he couldn't hold it. Anokhin released the tow line. The flying tank glided alone, heavy but stable, down through the haze. Against all expectation, it flew. He aimed for an open field, flared, touched down hard, and rolled to a stop. Ground crew rushed out, expecting wreckage. Instead, they found the pilot grinning, already dropping the wings with quick-release pins. Moments later, the T-60's engine coughed to life, and he drove back to base under its own power. The experiment had proven the concept, but also its limits. The Soviet Union had no bomber strong enough to tow it safely again. The A-40 flying tank had taken off once, and never would again. On paper, the A-40 was clever. In the air, it was an anchor with ambitions. Even stripped to the bones, the T-60 and its airframe produced too much drag for any Soviet bomber to handle. The TB-3 tow plane had given everything it had. Its engines ran red-hot, just keeping the tank level. At full power, it could barely reach 130 kilometers an hour. The A-40 needed at least 160 to stay up. Antonov's team tried to imagine workarounds, adding a second tug aircraft, fitting more powerful P-8 engines, or redesigning the tank with lighter armor. Every solution added cost and complexity that wartime production couldn't afford. And then there was the combat reality. To make it light enough to fly, the tank had been stripped of ammunition and fuel, sometimes even its turret. That meant the flying tank would have to land, wait for supply gliders or parachutes to arrive, reload, refuel, and only then fight. The very delay it was meant to avoid returned in another form. The verdict from Moscow was simple: brilliant idea, impossible timing. The A-40 was quietly shelved. Despite the program's cancellation, the test became legend inside Antonov's bureau. They loved the image. A tank that had flown across the Moscow sky, landed in a field, shed its wings, and drove home under its own power. Test pilot Sergei Anokhin later joked that it was the first flight in history where the landing gear kept driving afterward. Antonov kept the photos, ground shots, not the famous airborne fake, and pinned them in his office as proof that the impossible sometimes just needs an engine and courage. The lone prototype was dismantled. The Red Army went back to more practical experiments: cargo gliders, underslung tanks, and brute force logistics. The Soviets weren't alone in chasing the dream of airborne armor. The British built the General Aircraft Hamilcar glider, large enough to carry a Tetrarch light tank. The Germans designed the enormous May 321 Gigant, a glider that could haul a truck or gun. Antonov's twist was philosophical. The Western powers built gliders that carried tanks. He built a tank that carried its own glider. The distinction made it one of the strangest machines of the Second World War, part aircraft, part symbol of desperation. And for anyone wondering about the nickname flying tank, that really belonged to the Ilyushin Il-2 attack plane, an armored beast that earned the title through battle, not through wings bolted to a turret. In the end, the Antonov A-40 never saw combat, never flew again, and never should have worked at all. But it did fly, once. Long enough for its pilot to prove that Soviet imagination could sometimes leap farther than Soviet horsepower. It's remembered today not as a failure, but as a monument to wartime creativity. A flying tank that lifted off from a Moscow airfield, hung in the sky for a few brief minutes, and came back down to earth as a legend.